Art 120, this is going to be a two-part video. The first part of the video we will be looking at the Photoshop interface and just setting it up, getting it ready to process an image. In the second video we will actually go ahead and process this image that we have here. Just to note that this is processing it in Photoshop. This is thinking about a file as if it were already put through the either Camera Raw dialog box or was scanned in from film. So first we're just going to talk a little bit about the Photoshop interface a little bit more, just go over a few other items that we haven't gone over thus far in the first processing video. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go up to the Photoshop drop-down menu and we're going to actually open up the preferences, and this is just really to try to speed up how Photoshop is working. One thing I mentioned in class today is that it's a good idea always to make sure that you don't have other programs open or another Photoshop file as you're working on your pictures. And another thing that you may want to check is how much memory is allocated to to Photoshop as you're running Photoshop. So we find that information out by going into preferences. But before I go into the performance and how RAM is allocated to Photoshop, I'm going to go down and just sort of set up the interface of Photoshop. And so I open up the preferences. One thing I mentioned in class today too is that I always think it's a good idea to change the background of the tools and the palettes, and then also the background of that goes outside of the image canvas as you're sort of zooming in and out. And I think it's a good idea to change this so that the background is actually middle gray for both. And really it'll be more probably apparent if you end up working in color photography, but it's really that if you work with different tones, it actually changes the perception of both exposure and color. So I think working in middle gray hopefully will give us a more accurate read as we process our images and then finally get them ready for output. So I'm going to go down from interface. I'm not going to go through each one of these various menus here, but I'm going to go down to this one that says performance, and I'm going to go to the first part where it says memory usage, and you can see this is talking about RAM that's available through the computer right now in megabytes, and then Photoshop, how much is allocated to Photoshop. So I'm actually going to up this, and I mentioned this in class. Usually I crank this pretty high. Here I'm going to crank it up to 90%. So that means that 90% of the RAM is going to be allocated to Photoshop, so as I'm working on bigger files, it will run quicker. I think it's a good idea to up this. I don't up it all the way because if you do need to have another program open, probably even the OS to operate, so that it's not glitching out totally, I'd probably leave it between somewhere 90 and 95%. And again, it's a good idea to close out of all the programs or applications as you are working in Photoshop. Just one other thing I'm just going to mention here on history states, and really we're going to be working on what are called adjustment layers, but sometimes people prefer to work with history in the history brush as a way of sort of stepping backwards or going back and forth as you're kind of working. History states if you change this number, if you go up to a higher number, it'll save more histories, meaning that you have more steps that you could step back in as you're working. Or you could lower this number. Photoshop runs faster if you work with a lower number. So typically I don't use history so much. I don't step back so much. I usually lower this number down to somewhere around 25. But if you use history, or if you're using history to step backwards and you find it useful to have those states saved so that you can go backwards, you may want to have a higher number there, but I'm going to lower it to 25. And then I'm just going to click OK, and you can see the interface change slightly. Now I have a middle gray background, and the background of the Photoshop windows and palettes and options and so forth are just a little bit darker than that. If I go over to the right hand side, I'm just going to go back and just show you where we set up our interface, and you can see I have my stored interface here. And one thing I noted today is that if you're working on the computers in our labs, your interface probably won't get saved, so you need to go back and reset it every time. Again, we selected the photography interface, and then we opened up a few windows, including info palette and I believe actions and adjustments or something like that. So I'm just going to leave it on the JWF, which is the interface I'm going to be using for this class. So just a couple other things that we noted when we were working initially with the interface. Again, our tool palette's over here on the left-hand side. The options for all these tools appear above, and you can see it changing under this bar here under where it says Adobe Photoshop 2020. As I click through these different tools, those options change. And today we talked about that a little bit and sort of changing some of those options by going up to the bars, but also really using quick keys, especially for brushes. So today the tools that we're going to focus on using in the course, or today we focused on the spot healing brush, which is the brush here that's between the eyedropper and the paintbrush tool. We use the paintbrush tool a little bit, and then the clone stamp tool. Really those three tools are the ones that we primarily use today. And I believe that is it. And we also talked about, if you scroll down to the bottom of the tool palette, you're going to see these boxes or cubes. Actually, no, they're just squares. You'll see a white square here and a black square behind that. These are really foreground and background colors. And the way that you can also reset these to, if for some reason you see a color actually appearing in one of these, is you hit these little squares and it'll reset these to being black and white. The reason why this becomes very useful is once we actually get into masking, but also using the paintbrush tool, also burning and dodging, we use these as our exposure and or masking tools or masking colors as we are drawing or painting on layer masks that end up making selections. So it's good to get in the habit of knowing where these are located, but also making sure that as you start using tools such as burning and dodging, the way that we went over in class today, and then also using the paintbrush tools to mask, how to reset these. So going down to the little squares will reset these if you do see color. If you double click, you'll get this box. So let's just say that I selected a color, clicked OK. You'll see now in the foreground there's a red color and then white. So then if I were to start painting on this with a paintbrush tool, you would see that red coming through. We're not using the tool in this way. You can see I'm stepping back in the history here. You can also hit Command Z to step backwards after one stroke. But what we're going to be doing is using the paintbrush tool to create masks. So to reset these boxes, I'm going to go back over to the little boxes and click it, and you'll see it resets to the default, which are black and white. If you need to swap between these, so right now, with my brush at 100%, with black, if I painted here, you can see that I have a black mark there. Again, Command Z will get rid of that black mark. If I wanted to paint in white, there's a little arrow, side arrow and then down arrow that are connected. It looks like a little upside down L. If I click on that, it swaps between those two. So now I would have a white paintbrush, and you can see it painted on my image. And I just step backward by hitting Command Z. If I want to toggle between these, you can go over and just click, click on either one. I'm sorry, click on the L, and it will toggle between those two. I never do this. The quick key to do this is actually just hitting the letter X. And this is really useful once we get into masking and burning and dodging, to toggle between adding exposure, adding a mask, or taking away from a mask, or taking away from exposure. So just to know to go between those two foreground and background colors, the letter X. You can see them swapping back and forth. So line, hit the letter X, line, hit the letter X, line, hit the letter X, line. So now I'm going to go back up over to my history palette and just step backwards to get rid of those lines. Okay, again, the tools that we used today were the spot healing brush, the paintbrush, and the clone stamp tool. And again, just remember, if you hover over any of the tools, it will tell you what the tool does, and if you want to learn how beyond what I talked about in class today, you can hit the learn how, and you'll actually get a little tutorial about how to use the brush. This is super helpful, obviously, if you didn't get what we covered in class today or through this video. Again, remember that the options above appear up here, and again, we're going to use some quick keys to change some of those options. That's it. In terms of the tool palette as of now. We will come back to some of the other tools that are available and some of the other quick keys. If you go down to the bottom below the picture, I talked about this kind of briefly today, but you'll see the percentage of zooming in and zooming out appear on the left-hand side. And then right next to that, what you see is essentially just a little menu with a drop-down arrow that tells you some options in terms of your document, and you can choose how you actually view this, or not, sorry, not how you view this, but how this is viewed and what information. So right now I have it in the pixel dimension and the resolution, so it tells me 360, and then the pixels dimension, which is always, well, actually here it is actually width by height, which is interesting because sometimes it's the opposite. So anyway, so you can also see the document size if you want to see how big your document is. So as you add a layer, if I copied a layer, you'll see my document size doubled because I went from having one layer to a second layer. So the right hand side tells you your new document size, the left side tells you what the original is. That gets useful if you are trying to save on space, or you just want to see how big your documents are becoming as you're working on them, or your files. Above, I'll tell you the title of the picture, and then also the zoom, which you're zoomed in and out. You see at whatever percentage. What mode, color mode. You can also see that here. If you go to image mode, RGB right there. Also tells me 16-bit, 16 bits here, 16-bit here, and that's 16-bit per channel. So we're working on 16-bit per channel. That's it for the tab there, the tabs below. I'm just going to quickly talk about the palettes, and that will be it for this video. So if we go over to the right hand side, we'll see all these different palettes that we're using. Right now we see the histogram, and again, remember the histogram is a graphical map. You get a histogram behind what's called the global. I didn't talk about this today, but just know that when we're working in curves and we're working in levels, when we first start making adjustments, we're working on what's called the global image, or the entire image, each one of the channels, not individual channels. But the histogram here also shows you the graphical map for each individual channel behind. So you can see they're all pretty close, which makes sense because this is a black and white negative scanned in as RGB. Next to the histogram, you'll see a navigator tool. This becomes useful later on, especially if you're working in abstract imagery and you're doing some really sort of close-up work and you don't know where you are in the actual picture. If I zoom in and say I zoom into where these people are, you can see there's a little red bounding box that tells me where I am in the image. When you zoom out, that box gets bigger until it's the full size when I hit Command 0. Info palette, we talked a little bit about this today as well. If I hover around any part of the image, you will see that there's what would be the eyedropper, which is actually the cursor right now, is hovering over one pixel, and it's telling me what the value for that pixel is, which is 208 for red, 202 for green, 197 for blue. If I go down, let's say to this person's clothing, you can see it's somewhere around 133, 136, 127, and that's really close to middle gray. If you look at where that person's clothing, where I have the cursor on that person's clothing, it is actually really close to middle gray here. If you go to a shadow area, you will see those values go a lot lower, 20, 22, 20. So that's really kind of close to where a black point would be. Something that's brighter white here, you can see that those values go up. And we haven't set our endpoints yet, so we don't even know if we're using the full range or the full scale of a black and white image. So that's it for info. Don't worry about the CMYK right now, the percentages of the XY axes, but really we would use the info palette more than anything to look at the values for an individual pixel. And for black and white images, which you will see once we actually turn this into a black and white image, right now there is some color information because of the scan. Those numbers will all even out. They will all equal each other because in order for it to be a black and white image with neutral values, neutral grays between the 0 and 255 numbers, all those numbers need to be equivalent when you put the cursor on any given pixel. Below the info palette, you have in the middle palettes, we have library, which we're not really going to probably use too much in this class. Adjustments here. This is a way to add an adjustment layer to your picture. So if I click on any one of these, you'll see down below where that layers palette is highlighted, a layer appears. Now that's one way to add an adjustment layer. And so you have different options, levels, curves. Those are the two main ones that we're going to be using for this class. And then you have a slew of other adjustment layers that you can at your disposal. That's one way. The other way that you can add an adjustment layer is by actually going down to the layers palette, and you'll see there's a circle that is half shaded. If you click on that, then you actually see the named instead of the icons like you do up here in the adjustments. You see the names. So really it doesn't matter. They both do the same thing. So I can add a levels adjustment layer that way as well. So I'm going to go back up here to the middle palettes. The adjustment layers, the properties will become important as you select an adjustment layer. So if I select levels, you'll see all of a sudden the properties for that adjustment layer come up, and this is how you actually make the adjustments to that actual adjustment layer. I'm going to trash this for right now so that goes away. History, again, is just, and you can see now I have a bunch of histories that are saved, so this allows you to go backwards, to step backward. So if I want to go back to the original when I opened it, you can either click on the main one here, and then it gets rid of all those layers, or if they're still there and you click on them, then whatever changes you made that were saved will be there. Now just know that you have a limited number of histories that you can step back. So as you make a command in Photoshop using any of the tools or any of the drop-down menus, it will make a new history, whatever layer, I guess, and then you can step backwards. But after a certain point, if you had, say, 20 histories and then all of a sudden you make a 21st change, that original history here goes away. So that disappears because Photoshop can't save the entire history of everything that you're doing. So each brush mark that you make adds to the history, and you'll see that happen. So really I don't use history too much. Instead, all of the adjustments that I make sure that I can adjust them by going back to the adjustment layers, which is much more effective and a not permanent change. Actions, the next button over in the middle palettes, we're not going to really get into actions in this class, but it's a way to make automated settings so that you don't have to go through later on. If you wanted to say, I don't know, like downsize 100 pictures, you could do it to one picture and save those settings, and then you send 100 pictures through what's called that action. And we use Bridge to do this, similar to batch rename, which we covered in the contact sheets. And then it will send all of those settings that you saved through that action and it'll apply it to all those pictures. Usually it takes a while depending on how many pictures you have, but if you were, say, shooting weddings or shooting portraits and you were using, I don't know, something like similar lighting, and you made these adjustments to every picture, instead of going into each individual one and making those adjustments, you can batch process it through an action. Again, we're not going to really get into that in this class. And then at the bottom palette, the two palettes that we use more often than not are the layers palette and the channels palette. We'll get into the channels palette once we get into actually making layer masks. But for now, just really the layers palette is the one that we're going to be focusing in on. So just a couple things about the layers palette, and then that will be the end of this interface video. Again, to make a new adjustment layer, we go down to the button that's half shaded circle, click on that, and you can make a layer. And I'm just going to make a couple here. And really two layers of that. And let's say that I wanted to also make a black and white layer because I didn't convert this to black and white. You'll see I have 3 layers, and just know that if they're on top of one another, the top layer will affect the one below it. So you should really we're going to do we're going to go through our workflow in a specific order, and that's the order that I suggest creating your layers. If you do kind of mess up like I did here, like usually black and white is the first thing that I would do, I would drag this down to in between, and you can click and drag and hold the layer and drag it in between the layers and then drop it. So now my black and white layer is on top of the background layer. So now I have 3 layers. Just so you know, if you want to trash the layers, you just click and drag them down to the trash can. You can also hit delete, and that'll delete if they're highlighted, I believe. Yep, there we go. So I just got rid of all the layers. So that's how you make adjustment layers. Next to adjustment layers is a little folder. We're not going to really get into creating groups in this class, but next to that one is a square with a plus sign in it. and that's the new layer button. We will get into this also, and this is just a new blank layer. So if I click on that, you'll see a layer appears with nothing inside of it. So if I click on off the eye of that layer, you're not going to see anything happening. We will get into what to do with this once we get into burning and dodging. I'm going to click and drag and get rid of that layer. Just one last thing in the layers palette for now. We will get more into some of the other options once we actually open some layers. The background layer here, you can see it has a lock on it. That means that it's locked into the layer and it's not going to move. It's not going to delete. If you hit delete, it just stays there. But you can unlock this by double clicking the layer and then naming it whatever you want to name it, or just leaving it blank. And then all of a sudden that lock went away, and now I could actually delete this layer. Nope, I can't. I thought you could. Anyway, you can unlock it, which means that you can move it, but you can also put layers below it now. So if I add another new layer, let's just say here, I can actually move that, what was the original background layer on top. Now I can delete it. And you can see I got rid of that layer, but I'm going to step backward in history to where it was locked. You can also relock by clicking that lock button. So that's it right now for layers. We'll get into more of the functions of layers when we actually start moving around. Just one last thing that I forgot to do at the beginning it's a good idea if you're working from scans really, or if you're working really quick through Camera Raw and you didn't, let's just say that you went through Camera Raw and you didn't apply a lot of settings, to check the color space that you're working in. So if you want to check the color space, there's multiple ways you can do this, but what I find is the easiest way to check it, then convert it if you need to, is go into Edit from the top drop-down menus, Convert to Profile, all the way toward the bottom. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th item from the bottom, Convert to Profile, and you can see here the color space, which was the color space of the scanner capture, was sRGB. So I'm going to change that color space into the bigger gamut that we use for printing, which is the ProPhoto RGB, and then I click OK, and then it changes the gamut. That's it for now for the interface, and just a couple more items before we jump into the workflow of this specific photograph.